The day had started like any other, with the sun barely cresting over the horizon and the city still cloaked in the remnants of night. I had arrived at the office earlier than usual, my mind preoccupied with the case at hand. It wasn't often that one found themselves going toe-to-toe with a man as enigmatic as Mr. Johnson, especially under such peculiar circumstances. His wife, a client of mine, had spun tales of his infidelity and deceit, painting herself as the victim in a marriage gone sour. Yet something about her story didn't quite add up, and today I was determined to find the missing pieces. The conference room felt colder than usual, the air heavy with anticipation. Mr. Johnson entered without a sound, his presence almost ghost-like. He was a medium-built man, with sharp features that seemed too refined, too calculated. His suit was impeccably tailored, fitting him like a second skin, and he moved with an ease that spoke of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous waters. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us today," I began, my voice steady despite the unease that knotted my stomach. "I trust you're aware of why we're here." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "I believe so, but why don't you enlighten me, just to ensure we're on the same page?" His voice was smooth, disarmingly so, and it irked me how composed he appeared. This was a man whose world was supposedly crumbling, yet he sat before me as if he hadn't a care in the world. "We're here to discuss the terms of your divorce," I said, laying out the documents in front of me. "Your wife seeks a fair division of assets, something I'm sure we can negotiate without much difficulty." Mr. Johnson's smile widened ever so slightly, his eyes locking onto mine. "My dear, if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that fair is a relative term. But please proceed. I'm eager to see what you believe is fair in this situation." His tone, laced with a hint of mockery, set me on edge. I pushed forward, outlining the assets and financial records, or rather, the lack thereof. Mr. Johnson's responses were evasive, his financial situation a well-constructed facade that left more questions than answers. "The house, the cars, your lifestyle. You claim they're all owned by friends and corporations." "That's quite convenient, Mr. Johnson," I pressed, frustration creeping into my voice. "Convenient, perhaps, but entirely legal and above board, I'd assure you," he replied, his calm unshaken. "You see, I've always believed in keeping my personal affairs separate. It simplifies things, wouldn't you agree?" I was taken aback by his audacity, his ability to dance around the truth with such finesse. It was clear that Mr. Johnson was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary divorce. As the meeting progressed, his veiled threats and insinuations left me with a chilling realization. I was in over my head, playing a game whose rules I barely understood. The meeting ended as abruptly as it had begun, with Mr. Johnson excusing himself, leaving a lingering sense of unease in his wake. I was left with a heavy heart and a troubled mind, pondering the true nature of the man I was up against. This was more than a battle of wits, it was a war, and I feared what lay ahead. The next meeting was set in a dimly lit cafe, a neutral ground far removed from the sterile environment of my office. Mr. Johnson had suggested the location, a choice that seemed calculated to put me at ease, or perhaps to disarm. As I watched him approach, his gait confident, a part of me couldn't help but admire the man's audacity. He was about to engage in a conversation where every word could be a potential landmine, yet he appeared as composed as one discussing the weather. "Mr. Carter, a pleasure to see you outside the confines of your legal battleground," Mr. Johnson greeted, his voice smooth, betraying no sign of the storm brewing beneath our casual meeting. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Johnson. Shall we?" I motioned towards the secluded table I had chosen, one that offered a modicum of privacy for the discussions ahead. As we settled in, the initial small talk quickly gave way to the matter at hand. "Your financial disclosures, Mr. Johnson, they're intriguing," I began, choosing my words carefully. "On paper, you're a ghost." He smiled, a gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ghosts have the advantage of moving unseen, Mr. Carter. In my case, it's a necessity rather than a choice." I leaned forward, My curiosity piqued. You claim to own nothing, yet live as if you have everything. How do you explain the discrepancy? Mr. Johnson took a sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on mine. I've always believed in the kindness of friends, Mr. Carter. The house, the cars, even the trips abroad, all courtesy of those who value my expertise. Expertise, I echoed, the word hanging between us like a loaded gun. In matters of discretion and problem-solving, he replied, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. The conversation veered into a dangerous territory when I pressed further. And what of the assets acquired during your marriage? Surely there's something to be divided. Mr. Johnson's expression hardened, a subtle shift that sent a clear message. Let's just say, my contributions were of a different nature. My wife enjoyed the fruits of my labor without ever questioning their origin. It's only now, at the end, that she seeks a tangible share. The veiled threat in his words was clear. Mr. Johnson was not a man to be trifled with, his assets hidden not just from the public eye, but entangled in a web of favors and obligations that one could not simply untangle without consequences. As for the divorce, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, consider it a formality. The real division of assets happened long before this legal charade. I left the café with more questions than answers, the realization dawning on me that Mr. Johnson's wealth was not just hidden. It was a mirage expertly crafted to conceal the true depth of his influence and power. In this game of shadows, he was always one step ahead, and I was merely a pawn trying to decipher the moves of a phantom. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I arrived at the sprawling estate of Mrs. Johnson, the soon-to-be ex-wife embroiled in the enigmatic divorce case. The property, a testament to opulence now tainted by the specter of betrayal, was maintained by a single caretaker, a Mr. Thomas Reed. Reed, a man of few words, had been with the Johnsons for years, his loyalty seemingly unwavering until now. I found him in the garden, pruning the roses with meticulous care, a metaphor not lost on me. Mr. Reed, I called out, my voice disrupting the morning's tranquility. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a cloth. Mr. Carter. Early bird, are we? I prefer to catch the worm before it turns, I replied, approaching him. I have a few questions about the Johnsons. Reed's expression was unreadable, a mask perfected over years of service. I serve at the pleasure of the family. What do you need? It's about the assets, I began, watching him closely. Mr. Johnson's financial situation is curious. I'm trying to understand the real story. Reed chuckled, a low, knowing sound. Mr. Johnson's finances, you might as well try to catch smoke with your bare hands. I'm beginning to see that, I admitted. But you, Mr. Reed, have been here through it all. You must have seen something. Reed paused, considering his next words carefully. I see a lot of things in this job, but understanding them, that's above my pay grade. But not above your interest, I countered. The estate, the luxury, yet Mr. Johnson claimed he owns nothing. How does that work? Reed sighed, leaning on his shears. Mr. Johnson is a man who believes in keeping his life compartmentalized. Everything and everyone in its place. Including his wife, I prodded. Including everyone, Reed corrected, his gaze sharp. Mrs. Johnson included. She's been looking for something that doesn't want to be found. And what about you, Mr. Reed? What's your role in all this? I asked, pushing for a crack in his facade. I take care of the estate, Mr. Carter. Nothing more, nothing less. But the slight shift in his stance told me there was indeed more. Yet here we are, discussing the intricate dance of assets and secrets. You're more involved than you let on, I observed. Reed met my gaze, a flicker of something undefinable passing through his eyes. Let's just say, I've learned that sometimes the best way to serve is to turn a blind eye. But even I have my limits. And, Mrs. Johnson, I questioned, trying to untangle the web of loyalties. She's searching for answers in a house of mirrors, Reed replied, a note of sympathy in his voice. "And I fear what she'll find if she ever reaches the truth." His words hung between us, a warning or perhaps a prophecy. Reeb returned to his roses, and I left with more questions than answers. The caretaker's facade had cracked, revealing glimpses of a complex loyalty and a household balanced on the edge of revelation. The game of shadows and mirrors wasn't just confined to the estranged couple, but had ensnared everyone around them, each playing their part in the masquerade. After my revealing encounter with Mrs. Harper, it became clear that the depths of deceit within the Johnson family were more intricate than I had initially surmised. The next piece of the puzzle lay with a character shrouded in even greater mystery. Marcus Trenton. Trenton was a financial advisor, recently linked with the Johnsons, known for his discreet handling of sensitive matters. The whispers in the shadows suggested he was the architect behind the financial maneuvers designed to protect the Johnson assets. I found Trenton in a high-rise building downtown, the kind that screamed power and secrecy from its steel bones. The reception was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of Mrs. Harper's home, setting the tone for the conversation that was about to unfold. "Mr. Trenton, thank you for meeting with me," I began, as we sat across from each other in his office, a minimalist space that felt more like a fortress. "Mr. Carter, your reputation precedes you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Trenton's voice was smooth, his demeanor unflappable. "I'm here to discuss the Johnson family. Specifically, your role in the restructuring of their assets," I stated, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Trenton smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "I provide many services to my clients, Mr. Carter. Discretion being the foremost. I'm sure you understand. Discretion that involves hiding assets during a divorce is a serious matter, Mr. Trenton. Especially when it involves manipulating trusts and offshore accounts," I pressed, watching for any crack in his composed exterior. "Allegations require proof, Mr. Carter. And in the world of high finance, the line between legality and creativity is often blurred," Trenton replied, his confidence unshaken. "Are you saying you did nothing illegal, or simply that you're skilled at not getting caught?" I challenged. "Mr. Carter, I ensure my clients' assets are protected. The complexities of such transactions are often misunderstood by those not in the field. As for your insinuations, I suggest you tread carefully. Accusations can be damaging to both reputations and to health." The veiled threat hung in the air between us, a clear indication that I was treading on dangerous ground. Trenton's involvement was a critical link in the chain of deceit, but his warning made it clear that digging further could have dire consequences. "Understood, Mr. Trenton. But know this, the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it's buried," I said, standing to leave. "As does danger, Mr. Carter. I would hate for you to find yourself in an unfortunate situation," Trenton replied, his tone icy. As I exited the building, the weight of the hidden threat lingered on my shoulders. Trenton was a formidable adversary, one who played the game with a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that could not be underestimated. The battle lines were drawn, and I knew that uncovering the full extent of the betrayal within the Johnson family would require navigating a minefield of financial deceit and moral corruption. The hidden threat was no longer just a part of the puzzle. It had become a stark reality, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. The case took an unexpected turn with the sudden death of Mr. Johnson. What was initially a battle over assets in a divorce now morphed into a complex investigation into his estate, with implications far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. His death, while shocking, was not considered suspicious, yet it cast a long shadow over the proceedings, introducing a new level of intrigue and urgency. I found myself back at the Johnson estate, this time to meet with the executor of Mr. Johnson's will, a lawyer named Gregory Hammond. The estate, once vibrant and full of life, now felt like a mausoleum, each room echoing the absence of its owner. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming on such short notice," Hammond greeted me, his voice somber. "Mr. Hammond, the circumstances are most unfortunate." Has there been any progress in understanding the implications of Mr. Johnson's passing on the estate and the ongoing legal matters? I inquired, getting straight to the point. Hammond sighed, leading me into the study where countless legal documents were spread across the desk. Mr. Johnson's will has revealed a number of surprises, not least of which is a series of conditional bequests that are, frankly, unprecedented. Conditional bequests? Could you elaborate? I asked, my interest piqued. Indeed. Mr. Johnson stipulated that certain assets, previously thought to be part of the divorce settlement, are now to be held in trust for various philanthropic causes, but only if certain conditions are met by the beneficiaries. It's a legal labyrinth, Hammond explained, his frustration evident. And what does this mean for Mrs. Johnson's settlement? I pressed, trying to understand the implications. Hammond looked at me, a mix of resignation and disbelief in his eyes. It means that a significant portion of the estate is effectively locked away. Mrs. Johnson's settlement could be substantially less than anticipated unless we can navigate these conditions successfully. The revelation was a bombshell. Mr. Johnson's posthumous gambit was a masterstroke, ensuring his legacy while complicating the divorce beyond anyone's expectations. Is there any way to challenge the will? To argue that these conditions are unreasonable or even vindictive? I asked, thinking aloud. Hammond leaned back in his chair, pondering the question. It's a difficult path. Mr. Johnson was meticulous in his planning. Each condition is tied to a charitable cause, making any challenge appear self-serving or greedy. It's a dead man's gambit, Mr. Carter. He's playing the game from beyond the grave, and I'm afraid he's holding all the cards. The conversation with Hammond laid bare the complexity of the situation. Mr. Johnson's death had not simplified matters. It had compounded them, weaving a tangled web of legal, moral, and financial threads that would not be easily unraveled. As I left the estate, the reality of the challenge ahead settled in. The fight for Mrs. Johnson's fair settlement was no longer just about uncovering hidden assets or navigating divorce law. It was about confronting a dead man's final wish, a wish that threatened to undermine everything she was entitled to. The gambit was set, and the game was on. The stakes: justice, legacy, and the true cost of wealth and power. The fallout from the revelations brought forth by Jameson Locke was swift and devastating, not just for Mr. Johnson, but for the entire financial empire he had built on deceit and shadowy deals. The evidence Locke provided was irrefutable, a damning testament to the lengths Johnson had gone to protect his wealth and power. But this was more than a story of financial fraud. It was a tale of betrayal, of a man who had turned his back on those who had helped him rise, all for the sake of greed. The media frenzy that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed before. Reporters camped outside the Johnson estate, their cameras and microphones capturing every moment of the family's unraveling. But it was in the courtroom where the real drama unfolded, a stage set for the final act of this sordid play. Mr. Carter, you've done a commendable job in bringing these facts to light. But do you truly believe that justice will be served here? The question came from a seasoned reporter, one who had followed the case from the beginning. I believe the evidence speaks for itself. It's not just about financial restitution. It's about accountability. Mr. Johnson must answer for his actions, not just to his family, but to the people he's wronged along the way, I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil that churned within. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Johnson sat at the defense table, his usual confidence replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Next to me, Locke watched silently, his presence a stark reminder of the choices that had led us here. Mr. Johnson, you stand accused of multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. How do you plead? The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, a solemn call to accountability. Not guilty, Your Honor, Johnson replied, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the man who had once commanded boardrooms with his charisma. The trial was grueling, a marathon of legal arguments and witness testimonies that painted a picture of a man consumed by his own ambition. But it was Locke's testimony that proved to be the turning point, his account of their partnership, and Johnson's subsequent betrayal, leaving a lasting impression on the jury. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, a collective sigh swept through the courtroom. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served. But for those of us who had been caught in the storm, the victory was bittersweet. In the days that followed, I met with Mrs. Johnson, now freed from the shadow of her husband's crimes. "Mr. Carter, I don't know how to thank you. You've given me, and my children, a chance to start anew," she said, her eyes brimming with tears of relief and gratitude. "It was my duty, Mrs. Johnson. No one should suffer at the hands of such deceit. I hope you can find peace now and build a future based on truth and integrity," I replied, feeling a sense of closure. The aftermath of the Johnson case was a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the devastating consequences when that trust is broken. It was a story that had begun with the whispers of deceit and ended with a thunderous roar of justice. But more than that, it was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, a spirit that refuses to be crushed by the weight of betrayal. As I walked away from the courthouse that day, the sun breaking through the clouds, I couldn't help but feel that, despite the darkness we had faced, there was still light to be found, still hope for those willing to fight for it. Months had passed since the Johnson empire crumbled under the weight of its own deceit. The city had slowly started to heal, its financial districts buzzing with a cautious optimism. Yet, for me, there was a sense of unfinished business, a chapter that remained open, waiting for a final resolution. That resolution came in an unexpected form: the return of Locke from his incarceration. His release was quiet, almost unnoticed amidst the daily hustle of the city. But for those involved in the Johnson case, it was a significant development. Locke had reached out, requesting a meeting, a chance to close the loop on a saga that had changed us all. We met at a small cafe, away from the prying eyes of the media and those still hungry for remnants of the scandal. Locke appeared older, the weight of his experiences etched into his features. Yet, there was a clarity in his eyes, a sense of purpose that had been absent in our previous encounters. "Locke, I have to admit, I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again. Not after everything that's happened," I began, breaking the initial awkward silence. Locke nodded, a wry smile crossing his lips. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you had hoped otherwise. I've had a lot of time to think, to reflect on my actions and their consequences." "And what have you concluded from all that reflection?" I asked, genuinely curious about his state of mind. "That redemption is a journey, not a destination. I can't undo the past, but I can work towards a better future. For those I've wronged and for myself," Locke replied, his voice tinged with a newfound resolve. I was taken aback by his sincerity, by the depth of his introspection. "So, what now? What does the future hold for Jameson Locke?" Locke took a moment, collecting his thoughts. "First, restitution. I've begun working with the authorities to ensure that every victim of our schemes is compensated. It's a long process, but it's the least I can do." "And beyond that?" I pressed, intrigued by his plans. "Beyond that, I want to use my experience, my knowledge, to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Financial literacy, ethical investing. I believe I have a lot to offer in those areas," Locke explained, a hint of passion creeping into his voice. It was a surprising turn, one that I hadn't anticipated. Locke, the man who had once helped orchestrate one of the most elaborate financial frauds in the city's history, was now advocating for ethics and transparency in business. "Locke, I have to say, I'm impressed. It seems prison has changed you, and for the better," I admitted, my previous skepticism giving way to a cautious optimism. Locke chuckled, a sound devoid of any bitterness. "Prison has a way of doing that, of stripping away your illusions and forcing you to confront the truth. I'm not the same man I was, and I'm grateful for that." Our meeting ended with a handshake, a mutual recognition of the past, and a shared hope for the future. As I watched Locke walk away, I couldn't help but feel that this was the true closure we had both been seeking. Not just the end of a legal battle, but the beginning of a genuine attempt at redemption. The return of Jameson Locke, wasn't just a postscript to the Johnson case. It was a testament to the possibility of change, of finding a path back from even the darkest of places. And for the city, still healing from the scars of betrayal and greed, it was a reminder that redemption, though difficult, was always within reach.